All right, folks, so I just finished evaluating your practice concept content application FRQ. And I have to say, for the most part, I'm pleased. You know, if you get 3 or higher, you're doing the right thing. So a couple things that I want to address here in the general comments. So one, it is a concept application. So when they talk about concepts, you're really focusing on your IDs. They're going to want you to use the government vocabulary and indicate that you remember, understand what those terms mean. So whenever you use a term, make sure that you're defining, describing it. You will also note that it is called a concept content application. So they're asking you to move higher up here on Bloom's taxonomy. They just don't want you to identify and define the terms that we've been learning all year. You're going to have to show how they are used in the context that they provide. How is that term applied to this context of refugee resettlement, by the decision being made by local communities? So that's a key aspect to this particular FRQ, because if you don't do that application piece, they're not going to award you the point. So let's look at the specific at the FRQ here. All right, so here is the key. So this was like the concept, or I would say the scenario in which you had to demonstrate your understanding, is that in Beltrami County back in 2020, the Board of Commissioners held a vote about resettlement of refugees, and they voted it down. They voted no to accepting refugees in Beltrami County. Okay? The first question, and then here's another thing. Most of you are doing this, but absolutely make sure you divide your response into A, B, and C. Okay? Don't make the evaluator have to search around in your answer for where you're addressing each part of this. Vast majority of you are doing that, and it's great. Okay. Also remember, it's not an essay. You do have to write in complete sentences, but you just get in, answer the question, get out. Okay. So the first question was, in terms of power in a federal system, identify and define the process President Trump initiated with his executive order. We were looking for you to use vocabulary specifically from Unit 5, so that federalism vocabulary. The first thing that you always want to do is use the language of the prompt. So that means that you're pretty much going to start your response with, in terms of power in a federal system, the process initiated by President Trump with his executive order was, and then you go about your answer. So that will keep you from getting a lot of wrong answers. So 1 point was awarded for identifying and correctly defining and describing devolution as the process initiated by Trump's executive order. You then had to correctly define and describe devolution. It is the transfer of power and or responsibilities from the federal national government to the states. A half point was awarded to students that identified devolution but failed to describe or define the term. Okay. Now this one really just asked you to identify and define. So you didn't have to do it within the context of the scenario, but those of you that then went on to talk about how the decision to allow for the resettlement of refugees was devolved onto local communities, that was excellently done. Okay. Point B, in the context of the scenario, explain a tool or strategy a Congress opposed to this process might use to influence the states or local government's decisions. So again, right, remember to use the language of the prompts. The very first thing you should have written was, a tool a Congress opposed to devolution might use to influence the states or local government's decisions is. And we were looking for basically one of 3 of the grants and aid. So 1 point was awarded for identifying and correctly defining, describing, and explaining within the context of the scenario how Congress might use an unfunded mandate, a categorical grant, or a block grant. Okay, a half point could be earned for a partial response. Now with the half points, just if you received a half point, just note that that means an evaluator, an AP evaluator, when it comes to the spring test, probably would not give you a point. They don't do half points. It's either 1 or 0. I like to award half points because it shows that you're on the right track, you're doing a partial response, you're getting there, right? So if you did say Congress might use block grants, make sure you describe it correctly. Block grants are federal funds provided for a broad purpose and unrestricted by detailed requirements and regulations. Okay. And then if you did categorical grants, Okay, we'll see if that is still recording there. It looks like I was signed into a different account. But if you did categorical grants, they're federal funds provided for a specific purpose and are restricted by detailed requirements, regulations, and compliance standards. Okay? And then we could also try and attempt to use an unfunded mandate where federal orders are mandated that states operate and pay for programs developed by the federal government. Now, in my opinion, the one that's going to be most persuasive to the states, because the states and the local communities have the power to basically settle refugees or reject this resettlement of refugees. I would think the block grant would be the most persuasive because then they could cater the program, the resettlement, to their community's needs. But any of the three would actually get you the point as long as you remembered to talk about the context of the scenario itself. So refugee resettlement, persuading local governments to actually vote for refugee resettlement. You had to have that in your response. A point was not awarded for the do-nothing strategy. Okay, I mean, unless you actually argued that we were going to allow the states to work as, or local communities to work as laboratories of democracy. Okay, then I might award you the point, but really, I don't know if you get a point for that. And then if you just identified lawmaking as a strategy, you did not get a point. You might get a half point. We were looking for something more specific, content from Unit 5, with the grants and aid. How the things that the states actually do, the things the national government actually does to persuade the states to help achieve nationally defined goals. Okay. Now in C, in the context of the scenario, explain how our local resident might use a measure of direct democracy to change the decision. Okay, again, use the language of the prompt, start there. So we were looking specifically for you to identify initiative, referendum, or recall as a measure of direct democracy. They only exist at the state or local level. None of those measures operate at the national level. Okay, so 1 point was awarded for identifying or correctly defining, describing, and then within the context of the scenario, how a local resident might use initiative, referendum, or recall to change the decision of the Beltrami Board of Commissioners. Many of you at this point forgot to actually answer within the context of the scenario. You identified initiative, you correctly defined initiative, you identified referendum, you correctly defined referendum, but you didn't do it within the context. So like an initiative that would actually take the power out of the Beltrami County Commissioner's hands and put it in the hands of the residents to decide whether or not to allow refugee resettlement. So ideally, you would have talked about in your response, refugee resettlement and the decision made by the Beltrami County Commissioners, okay? Now, if you just talked about like the state and refugee resettlement, I probably gave you the full point. But always, it's important that you remember they're looking for application. Because if you don't do the application, right, you're just staying down at the bottom of Bloom's. You're just showing understanding and remembering, recall of the term's definition. There were a few instances where when you attempted the application, you actually demonstrated an incorrect understanding of the term. And that's exactly why they're asking you to do the application within the scenario, because it does truly tell us whether or not you understand that term and how it can be used and applied. All right, there's your feedback. There's more detailed, personalized feedback, attached to your individual responses. Talk to y'all later.